Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast, where we talk with the people behind the current events and breakthroughs in brain implants in an understandable way, helping bring together various fields involved in neuroprosthetics. Here is your host, Laden Yurachek.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast. Today's episode is with Dr. Marc Russo, and he is in Sydney, Australia, and he helps run a clinical trials unit over there. But more importantly, the reason I have him on originally is because he's the president of the International Neuromodulation Society. And this is basically, as we were just talking about before the episode started, this is something that started in 1989. I was like, wow, what neuromodulation was going on in 1989? So Dr. Russo, pleasure to have you on the show. And do you want to introduce yourself and what neuromodulation was going on in 1989?
Sure. Yeah. Look, thanks, Layden. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast. I think it's going to be a fun thing. Yes, the neuromodulation has been around for a long time. Spinal cord stimulation was, first invented in 1967, and it was in the late 80s that a group of neurosurgeons and pain specialists decided to come together to look at sharing their experiences, forming a society around neuromodulation, really to try and share their experiences, to promote this as a therapy to colleagues who knew very little about it, who worked outside of the field, and also to try and improve patient access to the therapy. And I've been involved in and around the INS since about the year 2000.
Okay. Yeah, I guess this is something that I ask of people that have been around in the field for so long. What changes have you seen? And so the year 2000 is when you became more aware of it, right? Or were you already working in neuromodulation before that?
Yes, I think the late 90s is when I started to be exposed to neuromodulation as such. So there was a period of exposure before joining the society. And I think my own personal experiences working in pain clinics in the late 1990s is that we would have patients that perhaps we unfortunately termed here in Australia, we would term them sometimes train wrecks, meaning that these were patients with severe end-of-the-line conditions of severe disabling pain who had failed to respond to many different therapies, were often at that stage placed on high doses of opioids. And then we would select them in where it seemed reasonable for a trial of stimulation, whether that was peripheral nerve stimulation or spinal cord stimulation, and then they would go on to implant. And you could see some of the results were fantastic, amazing, and really turned people's lives around. And then other results were very average. And it was difficult back then to understand, why did one person do well and why did another person not do well? And of course, over more than a 20-year journey, now 25-year journey, we understand, of course, that these patients are best treated early rather than late. They're best treated with as close to zero levels of opioids on board, and that doses higher than 40 milligrams per day actually worsen outcomes for spinal cord stimulation, for example. So we've totally changed our approach to how we select these patients. And many of the patients that we were implanting 25 years ago, we would now consider unsuitable candidates for neuromodulation.
Just knowing that they have, for example, that it's maybe too late in the process, or that they're taking the opioids as well. That's really interesting. So on the show, we also talk about something called bioelectronic medicine, basically stimulating the nervous system of organs to help with indications. And in there, it's beneficial to have a combination of drugs and stimulation. But you're saying that's the opposite in pain. Is it like a numbing effect, and then the body can't react to it? Or what's the justification that you found for this?
Look, I think the answer to that is still evolving. And so what I will give you is part evidence from literature and part personal experience, which is that I think it is possible to augment neuromodulation with medication, but those medications are probably going to be the type of medications that are used to reverse or treat central sensitization. So the ones that potentially can be beneficial can be medications like the gabapentinoids, other ones such as duloxetine. Possibly there's some interesting animal work around the use combination THC, CBD, so medicinal cannabis, to augment the effect of spinal cord stimulation. And we've got some evidence of that in animals that's come out of work from Chi Wai Chung in Hong Kong. We don't really have that evidence in humans at this stage. But critically, we do know that one class of agents which at high dose worsens central sensitization, is the opioids. And it appears that the opioids are significantly deleterious when they're used at anything more than a trivial level in patients, typically with persistent neuropathic pain, which is an indication for spinal cord stimulation. So it really revolves around this concept of central sensitization. And if you think about it, it makes sense. Central sensitization occurs in the brain. We are stimulating the spinal cord or the dorsal ganglia or the peripheral nerves. So if we're creating pain proximal to our stimulation point, if we're creating pain in the brain by inducing central stimulation, then we're going to be worsening the outcome of subcortical stimulation techniques.
Okay. And is the opioid something that lingers? Is that something that once you've taken it, you've had it forever, or does it go away after a day? But then the patients don't want to get off of it because then they feel pain. And so for them to migrate over to your method, it would be too difficult or something? Or how does it work?
You're asking some tricky questions, Leighton, at the very cutting edge of medicine right now. We used to think that perhaps things were fully reversible after X number of months, 6 months, 12 months. We certainly know that in patients on high-dose methadone, that effect probably lasts 12 months, maybe shorter for more shorter-acting analgesics. But now we understand this concept of epigenetic change, that a high-dose exogenous opioid prescription can actually induce epigenetic change in the genome of a patient, so that even if you remove something, such as opioids, after 5 years, the body doesn't return to its former expression of proteins and so forth. And there may be actually permanent changes that may worsen outcome. So the question is, how long does it take for epigenetic change to occur? What dose do you need to be on for epigenetic change to occur that affects you clinically? We don't know the answer to those questions.
Wow, fascinating. I actually hadn't heard about that. That's that's really interesting. It's a little bit scary, I guess, but I guess to be expected. It's like an addiction, almost like a body level addiction at some point. Yeah. So you mentioned this is at the cutting edge of the field. What are some other trends that you've noticed along your, I guess, 20 years of work in the field?
Look, I think there's been lots of trends. The strong trend is to understand that you want to pick the right therapy for the right patient at the right time, and that psychological stability in the patient is critical for success. So we now have the predictors of success of spinal cord stimulation lie in the psychological domain, not in the physical domain. So we're really looking for patients with a lack of significant clinical depression and a lack of significant clinical anxiety, a lack of current significant opioid prescription. And if we're looking for return to work outcomes in a workers' compensation setting, we know that the more years that have gone by with no work on board, the more difficult it is to achieve that outcome. So that's one aspect, is the selection process. The second trend that we've seen is really a nuanced understanding that we need to bend the technology to the nervous system rather than asking the nervous system to bend to our technology. And what I mean by that is that 20 years ago, we would just hammer out a strong pulse to produce paresthesia, and then expect the nervous system to use that and optimally. Then what we know now is we need to understand how the nervous system works. How are we going to physiologically interrupt pain signals? That two patients might have two different mechanisms. They might both have neuropathic pain, but they have two totally different mechanisms by which that pain can be interrupted. And we may need to actually look at an individual and have a series of waveforms that we can use to reduce pain. And we may need to trial those different waveforms in one device to work out which is going to work best for an individual. So that's another really concept that we've come to. And the third one, I think, is realizing that neuromodulation, whether it be intrathecal pumps, whether it be spinal cord stimulation or peripheral nerve stimulation, should be part of a multimodal treatment aspect. So that often treatment doesn't end with a spinal cord stimulator. The new component of treatment begins in terms of rehabilitation by using a spinal cord stimulator, eliminating opioids, getting the patient back into a physical therapy program, engaging the patient in goal setting, and returning to work, etc., etc. So it's not something that should be practiced in isolation, it should be part of a packaged delivery of care.
Oh, so the stimulation is not something that's there forever, that they're going to have to manage forever. It's a stopgap, a bridge to a more normal way of life or something like that.
Look, there'll be different patients in whom different things will apply. So for some, it might be long-term. We've had patients with 10, 15, 20 years of intrathecal baclofen therapy, for example, for central post-stroke spasticity and pain, as an example. And then there are other patients that at the end of the day might use a device for a 4 to 10 year period, but not necessarily for the rest of their life. One thing we've learned, certainly in pain medicine, is that it takes a lot of therapy to squash pain down to a very low level. But once you've done that, once you've reversed many of the chronic changes, then it often takes much less therapy to keep the pain at a manageable level. So what the patient needs at any given time point to get control can be different going forwards.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, sorry, I'm coughing. I'm coming off of a bit of a sickness. I'm feeling good, but I still got a little bit of cough and everything like that.
No problems.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Interesting. And when you're saying this, I've seen this, and you have experience with this because you're running a clinical trials unit. You're seeing this in patients actively. And I don't think I've ever talked to somebody who was running a clinic or involved in a clinic. So I guess, what's this like? What do your patients look like? What is a day-to-day thing? How do you treat them? I don't know if you remember the movie Awakenings with Robin Williams, and he's talking to the catatonic schizophrenics. I don't know, for some reason I'm thinking of this, but what's it actually like?
Different people have spent different amounts doing clinical trials. So some people will say, well, I'll do one trial a year. And in fact, what happens is the trial gets devolved to the poor, unfortunate clinic nurse who has to manage the trial, and the doctor is mostly from involvement. And that goes on, but that's not really ideal for optimizing your involvement for yourself, for your patients in doing the best. So I'm involved in my clinical trials unit 5. It runs alongside my pain clinic, and the two facilities are separated by about 50 meters. So I'm able to physically go during the day backwards and forwards and manage to be involved in both units. And in the clinical trials unit, generally, you're looking at patients that you don't necessarily know. Some of the patients come from your clinic and you know them well, but many times these are patients you don't know. And you have to be very cautious and careful that the clinical trial that you're conducting is appropriate for this individual, and you get to know them as they're involved in the clinical trial. And because they are altruistically contributing for society and also hopefully to benefit, obviously, for themselves, the safety of the individual has to be paramount. That's the first outcome from a clinical trials unit, and then the volume of work comes second after that. So I find it very enjoyable because it causes me to have to evaluate new therapy, to think about where are the gaps in current therapy and where will new solutions come from. And I find it very intellectually stimulating, intellectually challenging, and then getting some of the results that we can get, some incredibly grateful patients as part of that process.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I want to get back to that, but what's the pain clinic like? What's the makeup of this? And do hospitals send people to you, or how does it work?
Sure. So I work in a private practice pain clinic. I have an academic appointment at the university, but that's separate work looking at neuromodulation research there. Pain clinic had 3 pain specialists, a psychiatrist, 4 physiotherapists, 4 exercise physiologists, 4 psychologists, a dietitian, occupational therapist, 4 nurses. So it's a large group of people because no one person can manage the complexity of a patient who presents persistent pain and the associated difficulties and dysfunction that comes from that. So you need to have a group around you and working in a setting where you can be transdisciplinary to some degree. So we have nurses that case manage our very complex patients. They become a case manager and follow the patient over time. So it's not just the doctor being involved. And that's very important for really difficult, complex patients. And the patients are referred by general practitioners or by specialists. And we ideally want to be seeing patients at 6 months of persistent pain symptoms, and we will see them anywhere between 1 month and 10 years of persistent pain symptoms. So it varies.
Okay. Yeah, that is interesting. I've never, like I said, I don't think I've ever talked to somebody involved in the clinical pain process. Back to the clinical trials that we were talking about. Before we started recording, I was asking, there used to be a pathway basically going from Australia to Europe to the US to get regulatory approval. Is this something that still exists? And I guess what would be the advantage of doing a clinical trial in Australia?
Yeah, so Australia wasn't a bastion of clinical trial research more than 10 years ago. And there was a change in FDA rules. There was a change later on in European rules related to CE mark and so forth. So it became a longer path, more difficult, longer, more expensive pathway to do clinical trials in the United States and in Europe. And Australia remained very flexible. And the Australian government produced a change in the law saying that 50% of all expenses on clinical trials that any company conducted in Australia would be tax deductible. So 50% is paid for by the Australian government, even if you're an overseas company. And so then that makes it very attractive for companies to come and do their research here in Australia, take that back to Europe, back to the US. So a little bit of an inversion, if you like, of what was more traditional. And so far, that's continuing.
Wow, that's quite impressive. Yeah, the tax deduction on that would be big, because from what I've heard, clinical trials can be very expensive, multiple hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. It can be quite involved. What's that process like? A clinical trial, and how many patients are involved? Is it, you were saying that the patients are doing it more out of the goodness of their heart or for society, something like this, and so it's volunteers, and then how long does a trial go for, or is this all different?
It certainly varies according to the nature of the trial. But for example, medical device trials will tend to have longer follow-up periods. So in a medical device trial, it might be of a new form of stimulator or an advance in an existing stimulator that's going to be trialed for particular indications. And that trial will typically run for 12 months, for example, but there'll be extended follow-up data points beyond the 12 months. So there might be a 2-year, 3-year, or a 4-year data collection point, but the primary endpoint can be pre-specified as, say, 12 months, for example. And then those patients will be treated, implanted, followed over that period of time. And obviously the longer-term trials are more complicated because patients have other treatments that might come and go in their life. They might have a knee arthroscopy or something like that. And one has to try and minimize the additional number of things that happen to them in order to try and extract the data of, is the device helping them significantly or not. And then they're typically seen at between monthly to 3-monthly intervals, depending upon the length of the trial, documenting both primary outcomes and the various secondary outcomes, which will be more than just pain, will also be the patient experience, their sleep profile, their mood profile, any neurological change in their condition, making sure that there's no neurological impairment. So a whole range of secondary quality of life measures as well, for example. So we try and cover a gamut of things. And there's a group based out of an IASP subcommittee called the Impact Group, who have made various recommendations for what are appropriate things to collect in pharmacological and medical device trials, for example.
Okay, yeah. And then on the website, it says you've been involved in 60 trials, and this is for neurotechnology, neurodevice entrepreneurs, people who are starting out, or maybe established companies. This is a very important step for getting their device approved. And so theoretically, you might want somebody who's good at doing or running clinical trials. So what is basically at stake? And then what would be a good clinical trial versus a bad clinical trial? And theoretically, maybe why are you better than the alternatives?
I don't know if I'm better or not, but a bad clinical trial is a clinical trial designed by the marketing department. Okay, that is approaching things from the wrong way around. And look, occasionally you do see that sort of thing happen. What should happen is that you should have fundamental understanding of how something can be improved, documentation in animal models that there appears to be the case, and what you're proposing is safe, and then progressing to then involving that. If it's totally novel, then first in man study, which has to be done very cautiously, small numbers, very small group of people, looking really for safety signal first, efficacy signal second, and then expanding out from that to really work out what would the further trials look like. And often the experience of the patients in those first-in-man studies tend to direct a trial then to the left or to the right as to what you're actually going to. It may be that you need to change the dose. It may mean that you need to change the waveform. It may mean various things that you only realise after you've done your first 5 patients or 10 patients in a first-in-man study. But the larger studies may be proving out technology that already has a couple of studies under its belt, will typically be multi-centre studies, often multi-country studies. And so you may be allocated, in effect, 5 to 10 patients that may be suitable for a medical device for their particular condition. And you're really aiming to make sure that the patients fit perfectly inside the flags of the inclusion and exclusion criteria. Your job is not to explore, what about if it works over here to the left or the right? No, you need to be very particular that the patient meets the inclusion-exclusion criteria, and then you can go through with that patient through that process. I think what makes a good person to be involved in this, somebody who's interested in not just doing the study, but somebody who's interested at all points along the way, can we improve the study? Many studies go back to ethics because they need to make changes where they believe the study can be more targeted or the result can be improved. So you might make changes along the way. Now, you're only going to make changes along the way if you closely observe the patient and realise something, communicate that with the other clinical trial participants or with the principal investigator of the study. So somebody who really becomes active and involved and takes an interest in getting the optimum outcome, that's somebody who should be involved in clinical trials, not somebody who just wants to sign a form, have a nurse talk to the patient and put their name on the 20th position of a paper, for example.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I'm surprised that it is so involved, and it seems like you have an active role in this, and you need to have a deep knowledge of what's going on. Otherwise, after those first 5 patients, for example, as you mentioned, you could continue going down a wrong direction and just be uninvolved, as you alluded to a few times. Sounds like a lot of the clinical trial leaders are just kind of like disappear, only there when you need to sign some papers.
That's the rarity. That's not the commonality. But I think just as in clinical trials as in clinical medicine, I realised a long time ago when, recall I was doing a particular block to try and relieve pain, and I studied it and studied this in the books, and then I went to do it on the patients, and I think I had the ultrasound with me, and I went, this is not right. This is different to what the book says. And then you look at the anatomy and you realise the book is wrong. Okay, how to do this is wrong. And you realize that what's in a book is not sacrosanct, and that you need to not just blindly apply something that you read in a book and think that it was descended from the tablets of Moses. You actually need to think, what are you doing, and does that apply to this particular patient? And you realize that you can improve things. And that applies in clinical medicine, and that applies in clinical trial research as well. So I would encourage everyone to have the faith of their convictions to question and to always look for improvement. How can we improve? I want to be a better doctor 5 years from now than I am today. And how can I achieve that? And it's a continuous process. It never ends.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've talked to some of these people that have written the book, and they're also a little bit like, they're maybe also not saying, oh, this is coming from Moses, as you said. I thought that was really funny. But yeah, everybody's human, essentially, and then you just have to build on top of that. Dr. Russo, I think this has been very enlightening. I've really enjoyed this. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to mention?
Yes, just mention a little bit about the INS, if I can. We briefly talked about that at the beginning, but we ended up talking about some very interesting other subjects as well. I think for those who are perhaps not deeply involved in implanting, they may not think that the INS necessarily might be a useful society to be involved with. But the INS is a unique collaborative venture. It was set up from the beginning to involve basic scientists, to involve engineers, to involve industry in commercial companies, and to involve neuromodulators and those who practice across the various different fields of neuromodulation. And I think that's its strength as it goes now into its 4th decade. is that collaborative translational process that occurs in the organization. So you can go to a meeting and you can meet engineers who are working on something and start to talk to them about your problems and what you'd like to see happen. And they can take that away and take that back to their workbench. That's not something that happens in a lot of other societies that might be all doctor or all engineer and so forth. If you think this is something that you work on the edge of, have a look at our society, because I think you'll find there'll be good reasons to be a part of it. We have a great journal. And in addition to that, we hold a great scientific congress, and really something, if you're in the engineering world or the clinical world, is worth looking at.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I love the multidisciplinary societies, and I think that's very important because you learn a lot more from it. So yeah, do check it out. I think that's really interesting. Cool. Dr. Russo, this has been interesting. Yeah, thank you so much for coming on and staying up till 11:30, almost midnight over in Australia.
You're welcome, Leighton. Thank you so much.
Hope you enjoyed the show and were able to learn something new, bringing together different fields in novel ways. Until next time on the Neural Implant Podcast.